VP of Special Operations at Bronner. Dr. Bronner's, which is the best-selling brand of natural soaps in the US. He will speak to us about how to build fair and sustainable supply chains for agricultural products. Gero, since 2005, has been managing Dr. Bronner's shift to sourcing its main ingredients, coconut, palm olive, and mint oil from organic and fair trade projects. His team has built projects with up to 2,500 small holders, including mills, factories for primary processing. He helped build local management teams and supported the projects with their diversification, shift to increasingly regenerative agriculture, and sales of a growing range of regenerative products. We are very honored to have Gero with us. The company was founded in 1948. It's a family-owned company. It has a very strong philanthropic activist agenda, and it has consistently grown to an annual sales of 180 million, which it spends 5%, more than 5% of it on causes. Now, mind you, this 5% is from the turnover, not the profit, which is very unusual, by the way. Dr. Bronner, since 2005, has built a supply chain from organic and fair trade ingredients. This requires setting up several smallholder projects and processing operations, now operated by Dr. Bronner and partners in Sri Lanka, Ghana, and India, and some more. The talk will portray the company, its history, its financial rules that facilitates its agenda. It introduced several of the company's organic fair trade and regenerative smallholders projects, their opportunities and challenges. It really suggests actions to other companies that may bring them close to the suppliers of agricultural ingredients that's overcoming the economic and cultural divide between the global South and North. Now, without much ado, Gero, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and it's your floor.
All right. I guess I'll share my screen for everybody to see. Thank you for your kind introduction, Ali. I'm really honored to be in Cairo virtually. And the only sad part is I can't be there in person. And I joked with my colleagues, I'd love to do a virtual tour of the pyramids, but that's not going to happen this time. So I'll have to come back. I've been in Cairo only once in the past. 12 years ago, I was really impressed by the pyramids, but I think I'm going to be as impressed by speaking to you all. So the topic of today's talk is how to build fair and sustainable supply chains for agricultural products. And I will give you the perspective of what's really a small to medium-sized company in the United States that has, for, well, I guess philosophical reason, taken its supply chains in its own hands. And I'd like to present to you what came of it and what perspective it offers to other companies as well. So I don't really need to read this to you. I'll do it anyways. What's a supply chain? I know most of you are familiar what it is. It's in commerce, a supply chain is a network of facilities that procure raw materials, transform them into intermediate goods, final products to customers through a distribution system. There is the activities along a supply chain, which involves transformation of natural resources, and those could be agricultural. And in our case, they're mostly agricultural. There's raw materials, components that are made into finished products. That supply chain includes, and here's where it gets interesting, organizations and people. And I highlight people because, to be honest, most of the work we do in our projects, mostly in developing countries, relate to and center on people. There's activities, information, and resources involved in the process, but you'll see that people matter an awful lot. All of you know about the recent trouble with supply chains. The last 3 years, supply chains had somewhat mixed reviews in the media. And why is that? Number one, the COVID pandemic disrupted global supply chains in various ways depending on where you were. So there were shutdowns of operations, so availability of product became limited. There was hoarding going on as a response by trade and by consumers. And then there was real trouble with global transportation. We've seen it firsthand for Dr. Bronner since our materials come through containers from all over the world. So the availability of containers, for instance, became a serious bottleneck in some areas. Then ports were not able to unload. And then, of course, there are skyrocketing freight rates. And whether they skyrocketed or not depend an awful lot on what route you were talking. I believe, on the route from Sri Lanka to the West Coast in the United States, the freight rate went up by a factor of 4. However, the transport from Samoa to California barely moved at all because it was a backhaul. This is just to highlight that the impacts of COVID on supply chains was rather case by case. And one shouldn't generalize that everything got more expensive, but it definitely became more difficult. Yet there has also been global concerns about supply chains in a different way, which is the fact that many of those supply chains, notably the ones that start in developing countries, have been plagued by concerns about exploitations of workers. Textiles and mining are really good examples. There has been impacts, environmental impacts of accidents in supply chains, in mining and petroleum, the discharge of toxic materials. And then there's something that only recently has come to the forefront of the discussion, which is the deterioration of farmland through agricultural, large-scale agricultural activities. And all of you have heard of the destruction of rainforests, with the Amazon just being one of the examples where the production of ingredients has caused destruction of natural resources, right? So there has been pressure on international companies to take responsibility for their supply chains. The one example I can give, since I'm German originally, I'm somewhat familiar with it. So in Germany, the discussion about big companies taking responsibility for the supply chain has ultimately resulted, after voluntary action failed, has resulted in the passing of the Supply Chain Act in Germany 2021 that mandates that all companies over 1,000 employees need to take action to prevent abuse and exploitation of people working in their supply chains. That's a great start, but it focuses mostly on preventing abuse of people. Very important, but the idea that you can also use a supply chain to achieve benefits, social and ecological, along your supply chain, all the way to where the agricultural products come from, that idea is not included. What I'd like to talk about today is just that. The concept that a medium-sized company, family-owned, can convert its complex supply chain. In our case, we're talking about soaps, natural soaps, into conduits that may actually benefit people and the ecology along that supply chain. So for a brief introduction of the company, and Ali already referred to some of it, Dr. Bronner's is the best-selling brand of natural soaps in the United States. Now, mind you, we're not Procter & Gamble or Unilever. Natural soaps are soaps that are made from plant oils. And it's a relatively small niche in the natural cosmetic sector, but it's not unsizable either. So our company was founded in 1948 in Los Angeles by Emanuel Bronner, third-generation German Jewish soap maker. He himself immigrated to the United States in 1929. His parents were not so lucky and perished in the Holocaust. That traumatized Emanuel and made him develop his all-one philosophy aimed at overcoming national, ethnic, and religious division. And that's ultimately what he did for the rest of his life. Yet he was not a pastor and a businessman instead, and he used his brand of liquid soaps, which he actually had taken the recipe for from Germany. He used that to communicate his ideas of the all-one philosophy, and he used the label, the notorious label that many of you might have seen. And here are the examples. So we're proud to show on our soap bottle label. Here you see the 1 liter, the 1 quart bottle, peppermint flavor, as signaled by the blue color, our best-selling item by far. And what you can see is that our label has barely changed since the 60s. It's just a little better designed, but what it contains is just much of Emanuel Stinken. And what's on the label is not to be taken literally. It's an inspiration for many people. It's just a rather uncommon approach to show like the roots of a company's philosophy in that form. And it sure generates a lot of interesting discussion around the dinner table or at parties. So our current label on the right-hand side, just better designed, and it's more legible than it used to be. I like to joke, but it's part of how people recognize us. I should mention though, we're not a cult, right? Some people think, oh, this is a religious cult. We're not at all. We're a rather pragmatic organization that just wants to use the production of a simple item such as soap and a few other body care items and also food now to show that business can actually have beneficial impacts. That's really the message. So that the history of Emanuel Bronner obligates the company. And in many cases, it doesn't, and companies sell out. But this was not the case for Dr. Bronner. So Emanuel, he passed away in 1997. And then the next 2 generations of Bronners held on to his vision, that is using business for a positive impact on society and the environment. But Dr. Bronner's grew massively and professionalized. And you can see this today in our headquarters down in Southern California. We professionalize production. Our marketing tools are much superior to what Emanuel was able to do in the 60s and 70s when the brand first really started taking off, driven in part by a counterculture in the United States that was looking for meaning and purpose. Our public relations are much better than they used to be, and we get great media coverage. And what we also did is to far expand our philanthropy and activism programs. And I'll talk about this in a second here, just a little bit. Dr. Bronner started its responsibility as a responsible firm by taking care of its staff. And we're now at over 300 staff in the United States. When I started around 2005, I think we were 20. So this may give you an idea of the rather unprecedented and consistent growth of the company. So what are the elements of staff welfare? One thing in the United States you might know is that health insurance coverage is very much left up to, even after Obamacare passed, it's still very much left up to individual employers. And Dr. Bronner's offers what I think is an outstanding package of no deductible comprehensive health insurance. And I've been able to take advantage of this myself. So I have a sense of how good it is. There is annual bonuses that people receive. There is profit sharing programs. What's really important at Dr. Bronner's is a great company climate. And one item that stands out to me is given staff opportunities to grow. So I've personally watched quite a few people that have developed from working on the floor, on the production floor, to department managers. Quite a few of them are Latinos. That's our largest minority in staff. And quite a few of them are women. And to watch people develop, people that have skills and talent, is just, I believe, one of the most rewarding and enjoyable things to watch in a company. Now, one thing that really sets us apart as a company is that we spend typically 5 to 7% of our revenues, and that's revenues, not profits, on activism and philanthropy, a broad range of issues. that deal with social fairness, such as promoting fair minimum wages, animal welfare. Mental health is a really big topic for us. And that's something that we do out of the profits we make. But how do you do that? Because not too many companies do that. Most companies are proud when they spend 1 to 2% of revenues. 5 to 7 is rather unheard of. It's not that difficult. So number one, as I mentioned, we've grown very consistently since 2002, are not at around 180 million annual revenues. We're very efficient and profitable. Now, where does the money come from? Number one, there is no external shareholders. There's complete control over the spending. And the decisions are made by the family with support by an executive council consisting mostly of the department manager. But what's really important is that there is no dividends paid to owners for their personal use. And executive salaries are capped at a 5-to-1 ratio. That leaves a lot of money for internal spending on a responsible supply chain. And that's what I want to talk about today. And then externally on supporting a diverse range of causes, as I mentioned before. Briefly here, this is for 2021. It gives you an idea as to what we do with our revenues. Here at the bottom, about 38% of the $170 million we took in 2021 go for ingredients, and those ingredients are more expensive than for other companies, and you'll hear in a minute here why. There's wages, benefits, profit sharing, so those are all expenses directed at our staff, goods and services, and so on and on. And that up here, under donations and sponsorships, you see what sets us apart from other companies. It's donations, it's what accounts for 5%. So usually this little sliver here goes into dividends, or some of it goes into executive compensation. We don't do that. And this is ultimately what funds our rather extensive philanthropy and activism. So just to give you an idea as to how we finance this, and in plain language, the owners of Dr. Bronner simply do not want to receive money for their ownership. And that's usually how companies work, right? Is that owners just take something home. The Bronners don't do that. All right, so let's move to looking at our supply chains. You may wonder, so what are our soaps made of? It's pretty straightforward. We've got 4 ingredients, plant-based agriculture ingredients that account for some 90% of our total consumptions. That's coconut oil, palm kernel oil, palm oil, and olive oil. These are the ingredients you need to make good natural soaps. And then there's a range of other ingredients. You see up there sugar, alcohol, mint oil. The alcohol is for hand sanitizers, for instance. There's mint oils, and this is a fragrant, and then there's a few others. Why is that important, that 90% are covered by 4 ingredients only? It makes it so much easier to shift your supply chain to better value ingredients, to organic and fair trade. And the story starts in 2003 when Dr. Bronner started thinking, where do our ingredients come from? And there was always concern about exposure of workers in the tropics to pesticides, herbicides. Dr. Bronner started buying organic ingredients from brokers and realized quickly that this doesn't tell you anything about the social conditions on the ground. It just tells you that it's organic certified. And that doesn't often mean too much. So Dr. Bronner decided to go organic and fair trade on its ingredients. And I had the honor that David Bronner asked me to take on this job. And so since 2005, I've helped build an organic and fair trade supply chain for doctors' agricultural ingredients. I'd say the most enjoyable work I've ever done that has given me much insight into how global supply chains work, and also what you can do as a medium-sized company to improve your footprint, your impact. So we started in 2005 to build our own mills and factories because there were no organic and fair trade coconut, palm, olive oil available. At the time, we had to do it ourselves. Since then, we've invested in and developed some 10 vertically integrated farming and processing projects. To give you an idea, typically those projects, those are local companies that we founded, right? It's all driven by local companies, not by cooperatives. And these companies buy from some 500 to 2,500 organic smallholders with as much as 8,000 hectares of farmland. That's in Sri Lanka. Now, this is important. 3 of these projects are owned by Dr. Bronners or co-owned, others by close partners, which means that we ultimately have control over the fate of these companies and an impact on their direction. And that means we don't just buy from these projects. We get very much involved in their operation, in their planning and expansion, even though they're run by local teams. And I'll get to this topic here in a second. The attached factories often have up to 350 staff, so they're sizable, as big as Dr. Bronner's, in fact. My special operations team of 10 people, you'll see a photo later on, are involved in all aspects of the operation and their expansion. One key issue has been on all projects is the development of local teams, right? The idea is not that some white guys run companies in tropical countries. It's rather to support local competent teams and help them grow, develop leadership. Now, one of the things that has been added to our programs was the concept of regenerative agriculture. Yes, we started out as organic and fair trade, but over the last 10 years, the issue of regenerative agriculture, an agriculture that does not deplete, but rather regenerate soils, has gained a lot of interest in the United States, increasingly also in Europe. And all of our key projects have added the element of regenerative agriculture and regenerative certification to the program. This is the little world map for Dr. Bronner's. This shows the projects, the organic and fair trade projects that we purchase ingredients from. There, you can tell they're all over the place. It's a huge diversity of setups. Some of these projects we own, like I said, and here are the 5 projects that we own or are by far the largest customer and thus get very much involved in the operation. So that's Serendipole in Sri Lanka, Serendipalm in Ghana, Pavitrament in India, Kani in Ivory Coast, and then there's Serendi Cocoa. And I'd like to just give you brief snapshots of all these projects here. Here's the first project we started in 2005 in Sri Lanka. It's called Serendipole. Was my first one for sure. So we took over a dilapidated old coconut factory, and here's what the facility now looks like from above. It's supplied by 1,200 farmers, organic coconut farmers. It has over 300 staff now. It has an exemplary fair trade community development program. And I suggest you watch Journey to Serendipole. It's a video we did a couple of years ago, and it just gives you an idea as to what you can do with the fair trade, the community development component of such a project. Just a huge diversity of very inexpensive impacts you can have on the communities, the rural communities surrounding. Now, Serendipole also gave us the first food product that Dr. Bronner's ever did. In 2012, we launched our first virgin coconut oil. Why? Because we had too much coconut oil that was too good to put it in the soap. We joke. So this is an example of how companies can divert into new areas, not because they think there's great sales, but simply because we had a good raw material, a virgin coconut oil, and thought we want to offer this. I admit it was also the time when virgin coconut oil was really hot, so to speak, and we competed extremely well with the product. This gives you an idea of the kind of people that work at Serendipole, and it's these people and the management team that managed the recent turmoil in Sri Lanka. You may have heard of. The country went into bankruptcy, and the maintaining the kind of jobs we offer at Surrenderpol is one of the key things that are needed now in Sri Lanka. I just visited a couple of weeks ago, and it's really interesting to see how such a company can maneuver even civil commotion and the trouble of excessive inflation and so on. So good example of how companies can help a country maneuver through really difficult times. And what the company does is to diversify. Virgin coconut oil itself isn't enough to help the company grow. So we've added coconut milk, chips, and flour that we are now selling to committed customers. So to be clear, Dr. Bronner's is just one customer of our projects, because if you just rely on one captive customer, not a good idea, because you ultimately want companies that are sustainable and can manage beyond just selling to the founder. And then here's an example of what we've done to go beyond organic into regenerative. We started this in 2011. We took agriculture beyond organic by making compost, by mulching, by training farmers, by intercropping, and thus became the first coconut processor to achieve regenerative organic certification in 2020. So we've taken the lead on the movement towards regenerative agriculture. And here's a little example of what we're currently experimenting with, which is undercropping of coconut trees with a range of other crops. So there's rambutan, a fruit tree, there's manioc or cassava. And there is two, we call them fertility crops, that either bring nitrogen into the soil or also extracts potassium and phosphorus and bring it up as a fertilizer. So what this does is it produces, in addition to coconuts, other crops that can be sold to the market in a country that currently struggles with availability of local foods at decent prices. This looks like a real interesting approach to diversifying and food security. So we're really eager to watch the results of this. Second project I want to talk about is Surrender Palm in Ghana. We built it since 2009 because for our bar soap, you need palm oil. You know, palm oil globally has a somewhat lousy reputation because of the way oil palm is grown and palm oil is made, in particular in Southeast Asia. We did not want to do that. So rather, we built a mill that was more community-based, involving a lot of manual labor, and also did not clear-cut local forests, but rather bought from local smallholder farmers who had been growing oil palm for some 10, 20 years. That oil is sold to Dr. Bronner's and to two successful and committed German brands. And over the last 10 plus years, Surrender Palm has become a symbol of responsible rural development through trade. And I'll give you a few examples here in a minute. A couple of photos here of the kind of people we work with. So here's three of my favorite farmers in Abam, oil palm farmers. Here's part of the production that's very labor intensive. It's fruit cleaning. And I want to make sure people know we're using manual labor where it's most appropriate, and it has to be organized efficiently, right? There's no room for being inefficient in our projects because our products are expensive enough, because we pay premiums to the farmers. We don't scale as well as big operations, but these are the kind of jobs that women have locally, but we pay considerably better and we provide social benefits that are not common with other local mills. So this gives you an idea as to what we often do. We do like using manual production, but we're not crazy either. It has to be done efficiently, and it's really important that people are treated fairly and with respect, just like we do it at Dr. Bronner's. Here's some of the Surrender Palm management team, and this is one of my favorite stories, right? All these guys in the front are professionals that move to the countryside from the city, and they're not going back home. They have married, have kids, and they stay in a Zoom, which is a 10,000 people town and doesn't have theaters, and restaurants to offer. But the fact that this team is given a very long leash and freedom to develop the company with our support, I believe keeps them in the area. There's other things that are our pioneer, I say, is the involvement in regenerative oil palm production and mixed agroforestry, including mixing with cocoa trees. And that also has become the basis of the diversification of the company. It's adding cocoa, it's to make chocolates. I'll mention this in a second here. And then we are planning to produce cassava flour, for which there is, if it's regenerative, quite a demand in the United States as a gluten-free flour. There's turmeric. So this is diversification, very high goal for Sarandip Palm. And then we engage in a wide range of community development projects. And here are a couple of examples. So we've been building a Montessori preschool for 150 children. Many of them are the children of our workers or the grandchildren of our workers. But we also want to include other people from the community to give kids a meaningful education, preschool education that offers them opportunities later on in life and also makes them more sensitive. Most preschool in Assum is not all that inspiring. Another area that we get involved in now, and in fact, we just kicked this project off, as many rural places in developing countries, there's a lot of plastic trash around because there's no organized collection of trash. And we started with support from a German development organization, a collection program. The plastic is going into recycling. There's increasing recycling opportunities. This does not pay enough to have collection of plastic done under fair conditions. And so the collected plastic is used by Dr. Bronner via what's called an inset to compensate for Dr. Bronner's plastic footprint. That is the total consumption of plastic in our operation, even though we're shifting more and more to non-plastic packaging. So that's a way to help clean up towns in rural parts of the developing world, but also create jobs in plastic collections that are fairly paid. And then, as I mentioned, we get involved in mixed agroforestry. Here, a shot from above and on the ground, the concept being plant mix of various trees and annual crops to diversify and to increase productivity and carbon sequestration in agriculture. Looks beautiful from the ground and from above. Next project is Pavitrament in India. This is our source of organic and fair trade mint oil. We now have 300 smallholder farmers, typically small plots, 3,600 hectares, very intensive agriculture, 3 crops a year, land very much depleted from decades of use of mineral fertilizer, chemical fertilizer. And that project, founded by 3 college-educated farmers, has become, I think, one of the symbols of regenerative and responsible field agriculture. And we've been able to track the impacts that, in particular, our field programs, that is the production and distribution of compost and the shift to low tillage, conservation tillage, and the growing of cover crops, how that has over the last 4 years or so improved soil quality, increased the organic matter content of the soil, and reduced irrigation needs. I'd like to show you here, it's only a 2-minute video, short version of a documentary we did on Pavitrament a few years ago. And I hope it gives you the idea.
Regenerative organic agriculture is a strategy that mimics nature, farming in nature's image. There's no external chemical inputs, no synthetic fertilizers, no pesticides. It's a totally self-regenerating system.
We realized that one of the key challenges that farmers are facing is the deterioration in the quality of their soil.
हमने जो टेस्ट कराया उसमें हमने देखा है कि ऑर्गेनिक मैटर बहुत बिलो लो स्तर से भी नीचे जा चुका है जमीन का
The result of industrial agriculture has been a global catastrophe of our agricultural landscape. It's a massive contributor of greenhouse gas, both in the effect of how it's ripping fertility out of our soils, but also the chemicals themselves have massive energy footprints.
The key practices that farmers are using to regenerate the soil and bring back the carbon that has been lost to the atmosphere are simple. It's the production and application of compost, it's the use of mulches, it's crop residues that are just left on the fields, it's the shift to conservation tillage practices that do not go as deep and are not as destructive. It's the use of cover crops, so soil does not go uncovered in between crops. And it's rotational crops that bring back nitrogen to the soil.
और जो जैविक खाद हमने जब से तैयार करी है, जैविक खाद जब से लगाई है, तब हमें एक तो दो फायदा है, एक तो बीमारी से फायदा, कि दवाई में हमारा पैसा कम खर्च हो तो, और लागत भी कम है हमारी.
It's really important to us to make sure that our raw materials, we know who's producing them, we're in a fair long-term relationship with them. The way they're being grown is regenerative and respects the soil, rewards farmers, make sure that everyone's winning. That's our commitment.
हम सबकी रहती है और हम सबको मिलके ही साथ इसको सही करना पड़ेगा. इसको सही करने का अभी एकमात्र साधन ही ऑर्गेनिक और रिजनरेटिव एग्रीकल्चर है.
We have the solution. Like we can stop being part of the problem and part of the solution.
So this may just give you an idea as to what we do on the ground. So here specifically, Dr. Bronner started the compost production. We supported it. We brought in resources from development agencies. And to see how this over 5 years has a significant impact both on the, the attitude of farmers, but also the quality of the soil is quite impressive. And of course, you use these projects to have economic further impact. One is that we are helping Pavitra Men to market some of their herbs, not the mint, to other brands that are committed to this kind of agriculture. So there's Veleda, that's a well-known German brand of cosmetics. And then in the United States, there's Gaia Herbs that does nutritional supplements and buys now a good chunk of its holy basil demand from Pavitra Men. So again, just as with other projects, it's just helping projects grow. And then finally, just a little glimpse as to the kind of social development projects we do. So here are 3 Dr. Bronner's staff. On the left is Julia. She's taken on a project to provide affordable menstrual hygiene to rural women. It's a real problem in much of India. And we found a solution, which is washable menstrual hygiene pads that are helping women to deal with this problem without shame and free of taboos. Very effective, very inexpensive. So another project, and sorry, Ali, I may be going over by 5 minutes or so. There's a project that supplies 90% of our olive oil, an important element in our soap. And that project is Canaan Palestine in Jenin in the West Bank. They started just about the same time we did. It's a Palestinian who founded a company to make fair trade olive oil, and we've supported Nasser and Canaan from the very beginning. I think it's one of the most inspiring projects going on in the West Bank right now. It buys olive oil now at a significant price premium from 1,500 olive farmers in the northern West Bank. It has an extensive fair trade program, and it's on its way to regenerative organic certification, like the other projects, by intercropping olives with other trees, such as almonds, and by using cover crops, and by going away from extensive tillage, which is still common oftentimes with olive farmers. So here's Nasser and the crowds during the recent Harvest Festival, which is a common or annual occurrence. The background of Dr. Bronner's, as I mentioned, is Jewish-German, and there is an affiliation, I think, with Israel along those lines, and we felt we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket, but rather buy from both Palestinian sources, which are by far those who need support most, right? This is where we put our money. but we also buy some of our olive oil from a project from Sintiana, a project in the Galilee, organic fair trade, that buys olives from from Arab farmers in Palestine and employs mostly Arab staff. So the point here is we're interested in creating links. We're interested in overcoming division. We put our money where it's needed most, but we also don't do just single support of groups, but rather also try to help overcome persistent conflicts, such as the one in the Holy Land. Now, here's one thing funny that happened 3-4 years ago. We realized we had cocoa beans now from Ghana, and we started developing an excellent line of chocolates made from what's now mostly regenerative ingredients. Great taste if you ever get to buy them. Unfortunately, they're only available in the United States right now. And so one of the sources that's developed over the last couple of years is Kani. This is a women's co-op in Ivory Coast, founded in 2016. Dr. Bronner became its largest and very supportive customer, willing to pay significant premiums, but also support the project in developing. It's at 650 farmers by now and growing. And as with the other projects, we're helping the project find other customers that are committed to really good cocoa. Here are a couple of pictures from the project. So this is the processing of the cocoa pods after the harvest. On the right-hand side, there's the pruning of trees, something that needs to be done and has been neglected. That's one of our key areas. And then left-hand side, you see the drying, the simple manual outdoor drying of cocoa beans in after the harvest. And here's one of the things we do in order to support Kani to grow. We help build a warehouse, and we bring in a tractor from the UK just in order to give the project infrastructure. So this gives you an idea as to some of the projects that we have built and support. And here are the people at Dr. Bronner's that support the projects. It's our special operations team. It's 10 of us now. They're all professionals from a wide range of disciplines. We visit the projects, we give guidance, we help find customers. So it's a real broad range of things. That's really one of the contributions that Dr. Bronner's makes to the growth of these projects, right? All of us have a salary. Nobody gets charged for that. This is essentially a volunteer effort to support the development of regenerative companies in the global south. That's really the mission we have, and not just development of agriculture and production facilities, but also to help develop the teams. All right, so to close this out, what's in it for us? Why is Dr. Bronner's doing something like this? And what ultimately do we think is the impact? So we've actually helped build a community of agricultural regenerative projects worldwide, as evidenced by the little map I showed. These projects also become seeds of, we say, all oneness, right? But it's more the idea to use companies in good spirits to have a beneficial local impact on lives and the environments of our suppliers worldwide. There is a real interesting aspect that developing these projects also helps Dr. Bronner's to connect to our suppliers. This is something that's sorely lacking with most other big companies. They do not know who their supplier are. They have no idea as to what the challenges on the ground are. We know that for sure, firsthand. We have to deal with it all the time. And that also helps us look for solutions that are beneficial to those companies. And we wish more companies would do that. It's a huge headache every day. Honestly, my joke is we have a disaster every day. There's always challenges, may it be technical, financial, human, but that also teaches us how to deal with these issues and how to support the projects on the ground. We do one more thing, as I mentioned, we connect our projects to other companies that are interested. So we connect these projects, such as here Surrender Palm, to other companies in the north, and thus giving them access direct collaboration in good spirit with other companies, that's invaluable. So, of course, we get something out of it. Our supply chain work is admired, and it adds surely to Dr. Bronner's reputation and the credibility. What's the downside? Of course, these ingredients are more expensive. We pay organic premiums. We pay fair trade premiums. We don't scale as much. We pay better wages. So they are more expensive than just organic, typically 20 to 30%. We think it's worth it. And so do Dr. Bronner's customers. The future of all projects is product diversification, as I showed, growth, and then regeneration of our agricultural resources. And one of our ultimate goals is then to inspire other companies to engage with their supply chain. Nobody can be as radical as we are. I don't know a single company that has tried to move towards regenerating all of our ingredients, but there's nothing wrong for companies to at least look at one or two lines of their supply chain, engage and try to use their purchase of ingredients to achieve benefits locally. Final shameless self-promotion here. The book, I think this is how Ali found me. My book about our work, Honor Thy Label, narrates the story of our work as we started in 2005. And we hope that it will continue to inspire other companies to do the same. So I believe this is the end of my talk. Sorry, I ran over a little bit, Ali. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be glad to take questions.
Gero, this is it's amazing. I mean, it's really an eye-opener. I was telling you a story, initially, I'm currently in Nairobi, and I had to leave the conference early to sort of come and moderate. And one of the people were asking me, what are you going to do? So I told her, it's a webinar, Gero Leson from Dr. Bronner. And suddenly she told me, yes, I know them. They have this, and she was actually describing your bottle. But then she was saying, from her youth, going to camps every summer, that they were not allowing them to use shampoo other than Dr. Bronner because it was the only product that does not have abrasive chemicals, so it doesn't hurt the ponds or the streams. So apparently you do have a loyal customer who actually look at your good, clean business and not just the lather, like it's one of your... I have one question. Please, guys, if you have a question, raise your hands. Yes, Ron. Gero, please.
Go ahead, Ali.
Please, if you have any questions, raise your hand. I'll ask Gero a few questions. But in the meantime, please raise your hands and we'll give you the chance to sort of ask your question directly. And if you don't mind, we probably might be spilling over a little bit. So we might be finishing 8:05, 8:10, if you don't mind. Okay, Gero, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to comment on your story from Nairobi. So we do hear those stories occasionally, and they're heartwarming. And this is the kind of broadcasting we really enjoy. It's not through paid marketing, but it's word of mouth. This is how the company grew, and we'll continue doing this. So, anyways.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a few questions until we get people warming in. You talked once about the motive is a German teenager who's anti-capitalist, and he was very much convinced of a social justice. Now, if you cannot look at the grandchildren of this German teenager, how do you guarantee that eventually the mindset is going to continue? How do you make sure that the company is not going to be, when you have too many owners? Currently it's the second generation or so.
Yep. So
it's still concentrated ownership. Eventually 2-3 generations down, it's going to have much more bigger ownership. So it's going to be very hard. They might even sell it. They might even put it on the stock market. How do you make sure that it's going to continue, this DNA?
My bosses, the Bronners, are asked that question all the time, and I hope it's become clear. the kind of things we do, you cannot do if you have external investors, and you definitely can't do it if you're publicly listed companies, because your shareholders are going to give you a really hard time over it. And so what it means is that you have to maintain family control over a company. And Dr. Bronner is offered to being bought out pretty frequently. It's just what happens to all other startup companies in natural products, food or cosmetics. And what usually happens is that Unilever or Procter & Gamble, they buy these companies and then they say, oh, nothing will change, but that's not true. Of course it changes, because ultimately the owners have shareholders to pay attention to. So the only thing that Dr. Bronner can do is just to make sure that control remains with the family. And the way the ownership is structured at this point is such that it's impossible to sell. And there's talks about whether the company in the long run would be transferred into foundation. So the control over ownership is a key concern, because otherwise it would happen what you just said, Ali, which is somebody will snatch up the company. We're very profitable. We're a great buy. Big companies would love to have us, but we would just be losing all the impact we can have in the United States and elsewhere. So it's really transferring the company into a structure that does not give individuals full control. And by the way, that's a trend, Ali. So I know in Germany, for instance, 5 companies that have done that, where companies are owned by themselves or are owned by foundations for that very purpose, right? Is to just remove the risk that a company would be sold out and then run by investors.
That's the situation with the Novo Nordisk. It's actually the majority owned is a foundation, as you mentioned.
Yep.
And they guarantee that they continue doing this. I have a comment in the chat box from Emma Stein, and I would like actually to give her a chance to talk, to ask her question. Emma, would you please unmute and ask your question, please?
Sure. I am curious as to what kind of returns on investments companies see, either short-term or long-term, from investing in regenerative agriculture and partnering with you. I know you mentioned that Dr. Bronner sees a lot of benefits themselves, so if you could speak to that a little bit, that would be great.
You're asking, Emma, about the companies on the grounds, or who enjoys the return on investment? I'm not quite clear. You asked what kind of return on investment companies get. Are you thinking of?
Probably,
yes. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting.
Yeah.
In terms of like direct to consumer companies, so rather the folks that are shifting their supply chains towards regenerative ingredients, whether that be like marketing returns or something of the like, of being able to talk to consumers and say, look at what we're doing.
Okay, so tricky question. I was just down at headquarters in Southern California, and that question keeps coming up. And that's because our message is a little more complex than what other cosmetics brands do, right? What we do took me now 45 minutes to go through. How do you narrow this down into a real brief message that consumers can pay attention to? So I look back rather at the growth that Dr. Bronner has enjoyed ever since I joined, or actually before. And much of it is word of mouth. And I don't think it's that consumers think, wow, this company is going fair trade, which we did starting in 2007, or now going regenerative. I believe it's brand building, or at least that's what our marketing people tell me. And so it's difficult to measure. I think we take a somewhat different approach, Emma. We just think, and that's the Bronners, they think we need to engage in this. This is what we need to do. You do it, you try to do it efficiently, and then ultimately the reward is in increased sales and a rather solid profit margin. But it's not This is not a proposal to go regenerative and then become wealthy. Initially, you put money in, right? You develop projects. We put in millions into developing these projects. We're paying a little more for the ingredients too. So the reward comes ultimately by setting yourself apart from your competition, and also are able to charge higher prices. This sounds a little, I'm avoiding the question. I don't, but it's really not that direct, and there's no numbers I can throw out. You grow, ultimately you grow if you implement these kind of supply chains. You become famous for it. Does that translate into better profit margin, Emma? That's case by case, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Thank you.
You need to have your heart in it, though. You know, of course, we're watching other companies. Everybody's trying to try to jump onto the regenerative bandwagon now. But you have to do this with your heart. You need to be convinced, and you have to put resources in. It's really difficult for startups. I'm very aware of it. And we actually do support startups in the United States that go regenerative, because initially there's higher costs. So there's all kinds of hurdles you have to overcome. But ultimately, we think that it's worth it because regenerative is the trend and you want to set yourselves apart.
Lovely. I have a question from Christina Munoz. Christina, do you mind to unmute yourself, please?
Of course. So my question is, are Serendipalm and these other sister companies, are there social businesses, meaning that the profits are reinvested to multiply the impact, or are there local shareholders?
It's both. So the Serendipalm and Serendipol do have local shareholders. Those are usually, not always, of course, the management team, because ultimately you do need committed and motivated managers. But we're not just handing out shares initially, but we rather do this carefully. So there is a local ownership to this. There's social business by definition, Christina, right? If you just look at how they're structured and how profits are used, they qualify. It might give you a good idea to look at the journey to Serendipol. It just talks about how fair trade premiums are spent. So they are social businesses. That's how they are designed. They're very much designed in the image of Dr. Bronner's, in that there's no individuals that take home huge dividends, and that the money is reinvested. It's planning for growth.
Lovely. I'm gonna take two questions, one from Manuel Goren and the other one from Nat Brennan. I'm gonna start with Manuel. Please unmute yourself, Manuel. Manuel, please.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Hi. Good morning. Good question for you in terms of your personal way of tackling regenerative agriculture versus regenerative organic agriculture. I would love to get a sense of how are you dealing with these conversations with other suppliers, farmers? Like, how are you explaining in a very easy way that many companies are claiming regenerative agriculture without the ROC logo and seal of trust? From your supply chain experience, I would love to get a sense of how you're tackling this, because it's a big challenge in the industry.
It's a real big challenge because, as you know, the term regenerative is not protected under law. But that's the same with fair trade. People can make claims. That's one reason that Dr. Bronner early on, in collaboration with other companies such as Patagonia, thought there's a need for a standard. It's the regenerative organic standard. And you want to have that. Personally, I'm really honest. I hate standards. Certification consumes a huge amount of time, resources. But unless you have it, everybody is going to be regenerative without any evidence. And so for us, it wasn't that difficult, because in all projects we had early on in the early teens, we had started using regenerative methods such as making compost and distributing it, and mulching, and training of farmers. So for us, the step towards regenerative was not all that tough. Now, here's a secret. For tree crops, it's a little less demanding to go regenerative organic, because you don't plow an awful lot, for instance. You have a permaculture. Permacultures in general are easier. So what we're now working on with all of our suppliers is for them to consider going regenerative organic, because it is good to have third-party verification of regenerative claims. And our farmers don't have much of an argument because we support the entire process, right? Dr. Bronner's or our sister companies, they pay for the certification, right? We want to make sure that farmers are motivated in doing this. And the promise is that, such as the bananas that you can grow, or the cassava you can grow under coconut trees, that they will fetch a premium. Right? So this is how we deal with that. And what I can see is others going into regenerative, they do the same.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Nate Brennan, would you please unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you for the wonderful presentation. We're a regenerative organic herb farm here in the United States, and we're really excited about the movement. I just wanted to ask, how does a company like Dr. Bronner's not get boxed in with their options for sourcing with such a new certification? And how do you mitigate the risk for such a new certification? To say there's a crop failure on one of your ROC farms, how do you account for that? And I guess a follow-up question would be, what does compromise look like for Dr. Bronner's?
All right, so important questions. Number one is, it's early days in rock, right? And so there aren't an awful lot of sources that are regenerative certified. Dr. Bronner's needs more than just one supplier. We have a situation with one ingredient where we currently single source. It's risky. So for us, the way out is to support other suppliers, at least a backup supplier, to also go rock, because once you go rock and make label claims, there's no way back, right? You cannot just throw in non-rock ingredients. So we have that challenge. And again, our way out has been to look for multiple suppliers with rock certification, usually one main supplier, and then backups, just to make sure our farms, I want to make sure you know, so far we have only been buying from smallholders, right? So there's a little bit of risk mitigation through that. But even there, you have crop failures or low crops like we had in Ghana, palm oil last year. You do need a backup supplier to provide that. So pushing other suppliers to go rock. And then what was the second part of your question, Nate?
Just what does compromise look like to Dr. Bronner's? How do you compromise?
And compromise, you mean economically or risk mitigation?
Yeah, I guess in the sense of risk mitigation, or would you be out of stock on a product if you had a crop failure on one of your farms?
We just discussed it at length last week, right? We were actually making plans. You don't want to make early claims, label claims, right? That's the ultimate goal is, of course, to have a front label claim that says made with regenerative organic, or even having the rock logo on there. We won't do this until we have backups, and we're just planning. So who needs to go rock? What suppliers are we going to work with, etc. So that's the preventive maintenance, so to speak, right? You need to plan your supply chain to mitigate the risk that you're out of stock on something. So Michael Milam, our COO, is super aware of this. His favorite line is, "I have to make soap," and that's what it comes down to, right? We want our products to show the values, the certification, but we need to make sure we have ingredients so we don't run out of stock. That is one thing we cannot afford. It's not that difficult, though. There's a growing number of suppliers that go rock, and we sure have helped to, by now, at least certify 10 of them. But that's part of our job. We advise, sometimes we even pay for initial certification, because we do want to expand the universe of regenerative ingredients.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nate. I'm going to take a final question from Yusuf Abdullah. Yusuf, please unmute yourself, sir.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. I have a quick question. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, throughout the talk, I think the theme was basically a compromising of getting profits, compromise of earning stuff as owners. You don't want to get external shareholders because you're scared that the DNA will vanish. So my question is, okay, your company is special, but how can other companies who actually don't have this level of DNA and what you called heart be as sustainable or even anywhere near as sustainable as you are? Is there any hope for this? Is there a special formula, or does it have to include compromise that only a special company can do?
This is a tough question. My answer varies from day to day. Ultimately, of course, what we do is very much against the foundation of capitalism, where owners are entitled to this compensation. Now, we know quite a few other companies in the natural industry here in California and across the country. I don't think anybody's as extreme as we are, but you also look at examples of companies that are big, such as Patagonia, and then the founder gives away the whole company. Now, he does that very late in the game, right? He's in his 80s now. And so there are people who feel very much philanthropical and are willing to compromise on their own benefits. In the early days of a new companies, that's tough to find. And external investors in general, of course, they expect a return on investment, but you don't have to be as radical as Dr. Bronner's. There is room for compromise. And owners, for instance, could accept a lower return on investment for what they do in return for allowing their management to do things that are unusual. And that's really what we're trying to encourage, is for companies to look at what we do and think, this is a pretty cool idea. You can actually use a company to do good. In fact, many companies in our industry do just that. They pride themselves of being socially responsible and having the DNA of an NGO and so on and on. So there's always shades of gray, Yusuf. So I do not expect in my lifetime to see 1 million of Dr. Bronner's companies. It's a hard thing to ask an owner to part with the profits they could use for personal purposes. But there are people who are fine with how they live, and they're willing to let go of some profit. So anyways, it's a vague answer. All I know is there is a family I'm very familiar with. I know how they live, and I know how they made their decisions, and they're inspired and don't miss anything as far as I can tell, except maybe for some spare time, right? The work-life balance is always tough if you run a company like this, but I'm somewhat optimistic that companies, at least to some extent, are willing to compromise, right? So that's all I can hope for. It's very doable. You have to be profitable. I think that's the foundation, right? The worst is to have a company that's not profitable. And that we figured out. In capitalism, you better be profitable. What you do with the money is almost a separate question. And then if you feel inclined to use that money for using your company as a vehicle for social change, hallelujah.
Thank you, Yusuf, for the question. Just the last comment, I mean, just a sort of for our participant, it's really extremely hard when you work in agri-commodities, especially with agri-commodity suppliers, to ensure what your supplier is providing to you is actually, quote unquote, sustainable, ethical, etc., etc. I can give you a very simple example. I mean, last year, one of the major chocolate producers in the Netherlands is Tony Chocolonely. Now, this company, they pride themselves that they are slave-free chocolate. There is actually a foundation or an organization called Slave-Free Chocolate, and they removed them from the list last year. And the reason was very interesting. The reason is they buy some of their chocolate from a major supplier, which is called Barry Callebaut.
Yep.
And Barry Callebaut actually has, I mean, it's a major supplier, and they have a mix. So, but when you think about it, it's extremely hard. The way you went about it is that you went there, you've established control through ownership or through really hands-on expertise. I mean, I really commend you for this, but not many companies are going to do this. I mean, so it really might take what you're doing with Patagonia is to set some standards, but then you'll have to ensure that the third party that's going to enforce the standards are reliable. And it's not just a matter of sustainability or SDG or whitewashing. That is very common.
This is one of the biggest issues we have ahead of us, Ali, and the Tony Chocoloni example is a great one. And they started out as a very committed company. They were sold to a larger operation. They start buying from larger operations. Barry Callebaut is a good example. And these big organizations just do not have the presence on the ground, nor in their defense do they have the means to overcome, for instance, persistent corruption in places such as Ivory Coast. So it's not an easy thing to do. I sure know. I spent half of my last 12 years on the road, and it's a real challenge. We think it's worth it. It's not that easy to do, and all we can do now is just show to people that it's doable if you commit. And that's our hope, really, is just to get people to see there's a way to connect with your suppliers. That may cost you a little extra. You may sweat a little more, but it's worth it for all the reasons I mentioned. So you're exactly right. It's really tricky to maintain direct visibility with your suppliers as you grow.
Gero, it's been really fantastic. I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but it's really an open mind. And I thank you for sharing your experience, your journey with us. This has been really a mind opener.
Really,
now for the participants. Go ahead, please.
Thanks very much for having me. This was a lot of fun, and it's great to have an opportunity to get our experience out there. Thanks, Ali.
Now for the participants, I know we stretched it a little bit. We took it until almost 8:15, but for me, I had fun, and I hope you also had similar experience. Be with us on Wednesday. We're gonna have Tensi Whelan. She's the director of New York University Stern Center for Sustainable Business, and she's gonna talk about insights and trends in corporate sustainability. This will be our final webinar before the holiday season. So I look forward to having you in the webinar. Otherwise, have a nice holidays, and I will see you next year, inshallah. Thank you, Gero, again.
Thanks, Ali. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.